It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Thomas Brooks noticed the note. Karen, his wife of 7 years, had left it on the kitchen counter, placed carefully next to a half-finished cup of coffee. The message was brief but devastating. "Don't look for me." Thomas felt his chest tighten as he reread the note. At first, he thought it was some kind of cruel joke. Karen had been distant lately, but nothing in their marriage had prepared him for this. He called her phone straight to voicemail. He tried texting her, no response. By noon, his fear turned to panic. He checked their house for any sign of forced entry, any clue that might explain why she would leave so abruptly. Her clothes were still in the closet, her car in the driveway. Nothing made sense. Thomas drove to the local police station in Parkerville, a small town where everyone knew each other. Detective Roger Lynch, the seasoned investigator who'd solved numerous missing persons cases, was assigned to Karen's disappearance. Lynch was a man of few words, but his reputation as a methodical and relentless detective gave Thomas a glimmer of hope. The initial investigation was swift. Posters were put up, local news stations ran the story, and search parties were organized. The whole town rallied behind Thomas, desperate to find Karen. For weeks, the woods were combed, highways were monitored, and nearby towns were alerted. But as the days turned into months, the trail went cold. The only clue left behind was the cryptic note. By the end of the year, Karen's case had slipped into the growing pile of unsolved mysteries. Thomas was a shell of the man he used to be, haunted by sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Detective Lynch, too, was baffled. There were no signs of foul play, no indication that Karen had enemies. She had simply vanished into thin air. 2 years passed. Thomas had reluctantly accepted that Karen might never return. He visited her parents often, unable to give them the closure they desperately sought. Every now and then he would catch a glimpse of her picture on the missing persons board still up in town. But the world had moved on, leaving him to carry the burden of her absence. One late evening, while Thomas sat in his darkened living room, his phone rang. It was Detective Lynch. His voice was uncharacteristically tense. "We got a call, Thomas. A hospital in Arizona. They found a girl during a raid on a drug cartel. They think it might be Karen." Thomas's heart nearly stopped. He had almost lost hope, but now the thought that Karen might still be alive reignited the fear and desperation he had buried. Without hesitation, Thomas and Detective Lynch boarded a flight to Arizona. The hours dragged as the plane cut through the night sky, each minute stretching into an eternity. Thomas stared out the window, his mind racing. What would he find at the hospital? Would Karen even remember him? When they arrived at the hospital, the scene was far worse than anything Thomas had imagined. Lying in a sterile white room was a woman, her frail body barely recognizable. Her skin was marred by scars, deep, jagged lines that hinted at unspeakable torment. Cigarette burns dotted her arms and legs, and rope scars crisscrossed her wrists like shackles that had cut too deep. Her face, gaunt and bruised, was frozen in a vacant stare, her eyes devoid of life. Thomas's knees nearly buckled when he saw her. Detective Lynch stood beside him, silent, his jaw clenched tightly. "She's been through hell," a doctor whispered to Lynch. "Found her during a raid on a cartel that was trafficking women overseas. We don't know how long she's been held captive. She's barely spoken a word since we brought her in." Thomas moved closer, his heart pounding. "Karen," his voice cracked as he spoke her name, barely audible. She didn't respond, her eyes distant, lost in some faraway place. It was as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Psychologist Jonan Filler was called in shortly after Karen's rescue. It would take him an entire year to help her break through the trauma and begin to speak again, even in fragmented pieces. The road to recovery would be long, and her story would only grow more horrifying with each revelation. The first name Karen whispered was a shock to everyone: Abigail, her friend, a woman Thomas had never heard her mention before. And when Karen began to unravel the truth of that fateful day, the day she disappeared, everything Thomas thought he knew about his wife's past began to crumble. It took months of patience and careful guidance from Dr. Jonan Filler before Karen could recount the events leading up to her disappearance. Her memories came in fractured pieces, but when stitched together, they revealed a chilling betrayal. Karen had been out running errands that day, nothing unusual. She stopped by a local coffee shop, where she unexpectedly ran into Abigail Lewis, an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Abigail was charming, as Karen remembered, and they spent hours catching up. Abigail had been living in New York, working as a freelance photographer, traveling the world, or so she said. Karen was taken in by her stories, and when Abigail suggested they grab a drink later that evening, Karen agreed without hesitation. As the details of that night came back to her, Karen's voice shook. She remembered sitting in a dimly lit bar, sipping on her drink, laughing with Abigail, but something was wrong. Her vision blurred, and her limbs felt heavy. Panic set in, but she couldn't move. Her body refused to obey her mind's frantic orders. "The next thing I remember, I was in the trunk of a car," Karen murmured to Dr. Filler. "I could hear the engine, but I couldn't scream. It felt like I was drowning." Thomas, listening in the corner of the room, clenched his fists. Detective Lynch stood beside him, his face grim. Abigail had drugged her, and from that moment on, Karen's life became a living nightmare. Karen recalled brief flashes of being transported from one place to another, always in the dark, always restrained. She remembered voices, men speaking in a language she didn't understand. She was never alone, but never allowed to see anyone's face. Her voice wavered as she spoke of the cartel. They sold women. To whoever paid enough, the horror of what she had endured was still too much for her to speak about in full detail. The scars on her body told enough of the story. But the most haunting revelation came when Karen finally spoke about Abigail again. According to Karen, Abigail hadn't just betrayed her, she had orchestrated the entire abduction. She was there. Every step of the way, Karen whispered. She was the one who handed me over to them. Thomas felt his stomach drop. How could someone who claimed to be her friend have done something so monstrous? Abigail had vanished from Karen's life for years, only to reappear as a puppet master in the darkest chapter of her existence. It was a sickening thought, one that tore at Thomas's already broken heart. He could see the rage in Detective Lynch's eyes as well, though the detective remained silent, absorbing every word. But then came a revelation that stopped everyone cold. According to official records, Abigail Lewis had died a year before Karen's disappearance. There had been a car accident, and the body had been identified by dental records. The question gnawed at Thomas and Lynch. If Abigail was dead, who was the woman that lured Karen into that bar 2 years ago? Detective Lynch wasted no time reopening the investigation. Something wasn't right. Either the woman Karen had met was an imposter, or there had been a monumental mistake in Abigail Lewis's death records. Lynch began his search with renewed vigor, combing through Abigail's history, old friends, family members, and anything that could give a clue about her true fate. He revisited the car accident report that had declared her dead. There had been no next of kin to claim the body, which made identification through dental records the only viable method at the time. But now, doubts crept in. The deeper Lynch dug, the more suspicious Abigail's past became. Abigail had never truly settled anywhere. Her addresses were scattered across multiple cities, none of them lasting more than a few months. She had left no significant paper trail, no property ownership, no steady job. It was as if she had spent her life slipping through the cracks, unnoticed. This elusive history made it increasingly possible that Abigail had faked her own death, leaving behind the life she had known to enter a much darker world. Thomas, meanwhile, was struggling to piece his own mind together. He visited Karen daily, sitting beside her in the hospital as she slowly recovered. Her once vibrant spirit was now fragile, almost unrecognizable. The scars on her body were a constant reminder of the torture she had endured, but it was the emptiness in her eyes that frightened Thomas the most. Karen had been a fighter, strong-willed, independent, and now she seemed like a hollow version of herself. One day, as Thomas sat by her side, Karen whispered something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't alone. Thomas leaned in, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked softly. Karen stared blankly ahead, her voice a mere whisper. "Abigail, there were others. She wasn't doing this on her own." This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Abigail might not have been acting as a rogue agent, but as part of a much larger network, possibly even higher in the chain than the cartel that had trafficked Karen. Lynch's theory that Abigail had gone underground after faking her death began to solidify. But the chilling question remained, where was she now? With every clue pointing in a darker direction, Lynch intensified his efforts to track down anyone connected to Abigail. Old friends, ex-boyfriends, colleagues, every name was now a potential lead. But as each week passed, it became clearer that Abigail had mastered the art of disappearing. Every trace of her was deliberate, calculated. Then, a breakthrough came. Lynch received a tip from a private investigator who had been looking into missing persons cases connected to the cartel. He had found a lead. A woman matching Abigail's description had been seen in New Mexico, associating with known criminals involved in human trafficking rings. Lynch knew this might be their only chance to capture her and uncover the full scale of the operation that had ensnared Karen. As the investigation narrowed in on New Mexico, one thing was certain: they were chasing a ghost, and catching her might be the only way to bring Karen true closure. The search for Abigail led Detective Lynch and his team into the heart of New Mexico's criminal underworld. The small town of Espanola, nestled between the arid desert and mountain ranges, had recently seen an uptick in cartel-related activity. According to the private investigator's tip, Abigail had been spotted at a seedy bar frequented by low-level cartel members. Lynch felt the pressure mounting. If they missed this chance, Abigail could slip away for good. Thomas, though still shaken by Karen's revelations, insisted on accompanying Lynch to New Mexico. He couldn't sit idly by any longer. Abigail had destroyed his life, and he needed to see this through. Reluctantly, Lynch agreed, though he warned Thomas that things could get dangerous. They flew out the next day, a tense silence hanging between them as the plane descended into the dry, oppressive heat of New Mexico. Upon arrival, Lynch met with local authorities and briefed them on the situation. The plan was simple but risky: surveillance on the bar for any sign of Abigail, then move in swiftly if they spotted her. Lynch's instincts told him that Abigail wouldn't be easy to catch if she had successfully faked her death and eluded capture for this long. She would be prepared for anything. That night, they set up shop in an unmarked van parked a few blocks away from the bar. From their vantage point, they had a clear view of the entrance, watching for any sign of Abigail. Hours passed with no movement. The bar's clientele was exactly what Lynch had expected: rough-looking men, many of them connected to cartel operations. Thomas, sitting next to Lynch in the van, clenched his fists in his lap, his jaw tight with anxiety. Then, just after midnight, a woman stepped out of the bar. Even in the dim light, Lynch recognized her. Her dark hair was shorter now, and she wore oversized sunglasses, but there was no mistaking it: Abigail Lewis was alive. Thomas's breath hitched when he saw her. He hadn't expected the wave of rage that hit him. The woman who had once been Karen's friend, who had been charming and kind, was now revealed as a predator. Abigail stood on the curb, speaking to a man who appeared to be her driver. After a brief exchange, they got into a black sedan and pulled away from the bar. Lynch wasted no time. "Let's go," he said, starting the engine. The unmarked van followed at a safe distance as they tailed the car through the winding streets. The tension in the van was palpable. Thomas sat on edge, his eyes glued to the car ahead. He kept imagining what he would do if they caught Abigail, how he would confront her, demand answers, make her pay for what she had done to Karen. The sedan pulled into a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. It was isolated, surrounded by open desert, the perfect place for someone trying to keep a low profile. Lynch parked the van a few hundred yards away, using binoculars to survey the scene. "That's her," Lynch said quietly. "No doubt." Thomas swallowed hard. "What now?" "We wait until she's alone," Lynch said. "If we rush in now, we could blow it." They waited in silence, watching the house. Hours passed, but finally the driver left in the sedan, leaving Abigail alone inside. Lynch and his team moved quickly, approaching the house with quiet precision. The plan was to apprehend her without alerting any of her associates, giving them a chance to interrogate her before she had time to escape or call for help. When they breached the door, Abigail was sitting in the living room, a look of shock flashing across her face. For a split second, she looked like the woman Karen once knew: innocent, unassuming, but that mask quickly fell away, replaced by cold indifference. "Abigail Lewis, you're under arrest," Lynch said, cuffing her hands behind her back. Thomas stood in the doorway, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He stared at Abigail, expecting some flash of remorse, some sign that she remembered the friendship she had shared with Karen, but Abigail's eyes were empty. "Thomas," she said with a faint smirk, her voice dripping with mockery. "Long time no see." Before Thomas could respond, Lynch ushered Abigail into the back of the van. The ride to the local station was tense, with Abigail refusing to answer any of Lynch's questions. Her silence was unnerving, her confidence suggesting she still had cards left to play. Back at the station, Lynch began the interrogation. Abigail sat across from him, her hands still cuffed, her eyes betraying no fear. Thomas watched from behind the two-way glass, his emotions a storm of anger and desperation. "You can make this easier on yourself," Lynch began, his tone calm but firm. "Tell us what you know. You've been caught. The longer you keep quiet, the worse it gets for you." Abigail leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You really think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" she said, her voice smooth, almost amused. "But you're wrong, detective. You have no idea how deep this goes." Lynch narrowed his eyes, his patience thinning. "Then tell me. Explain it to me." For a moment, Abigail seemed to consider it. She glanced toward the two-way mirror, where she knew Thomas was watching. Karen wasn't the only one. She was one of many. Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had known Karen's ordeal was tied to a larger operation, but hearing it confirmed, knowing that other women had suffered the same fate, was almost too much to bear. "Who else?" Lynch demanded. "Who are you working with? Is the cartel still active?" Abigail tilted her head, as if weighing her options. "You're asking the wrong questions, detective. It's not about who I'm working with. It's about who's protecting us." Lynch's eyes narrowed. "Protecting you? From who?" Abigail chuckled, a low, sinister sound. "People much higher than you'll ever reach. You think I'm just a cog in some trafficking ring? No, detective. I'm much more valuable than that." The room fell into a tense silence. Lynch leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then who? Give me a name." Abigail's eyes glinted with malice. "You won't live long enough to meet them." Thomas, watching from the other side of the glass, felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about Karen's abduction anymore. Abigail had pulled them into something much darker, and as Lynch's interrogation wore on, One thing became terrifyingly clear: the people behind Karen's suffering were still out there and they were untouchable. Abigail's chilling words lingered in the air long after the interrogation ended. Lynch, visibly shaken, left the room to regroup with Thomas. The detective's normally stoic face betrayed his frustration. He had dealt with dangerous criminals before, but there was something about Abigail that unnerved him. She seemed fearless, like someone who knew they couldn't be touched, and that made her all the more dangerous. Thomas paced outside the interrogation room, his mind racing. The mention of a network protecting Abigail made his stomach turn. Whoever they were dealing with, they had to be powerful people who could cover their tracks, manipulate the system, and keep the authorities at bay. "She's bluffing," Thomas muttered, trying to convince himself, but the nagging feeling in his gut said otherwise. Lynch ran a hand through his graying hair and shook his head. "I'm not so sure. People like her don't bluff, Thomas. She's a survivor. If she's still here, it's because someone's letting her stay hidden." "What now?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with urgency. "We've got her. We know she's involved. Why can't we make her talk?" Lynch frowned. "We can try, but if she's really protected the way she says, then we might be walking into something bigger than we anticipated. I need to call in some favors. Talk to people outside the usual channels. We're dealing with an organization that's not just trafficking women, it's something much deeper." Lynch wasn't wrong. Within hours of Abigail's arrest, strange things started happening. Lawyers began flooding the precinct, filing motions demanding her immediate release on technicalities. None of them seemed local. Each had high-end credentials from law firms connected to powerful political and corporate entities. It was clear Abigail's network was activating. Behind the scenes, Lynch quietly began digging into her financials, tracing old contacts, and contacting federal agencies that specialized in dismantling organized crime, but every lead felt like it was being deliberately erased. Lynch had dealt with cartels before, but this felt more like dealing with a shadow, an invisible hand pulling strings from every direction. 2 days after Abigail's arrest, Thomas got a call that sent his world spiraling further out of control. "Mr. Brooks, it's Dr. Filler from the hospital. You need to get here right away. Something's happened with Karen." Thomas rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding with dread. When he arrived, Dr. Filler met him in the hallway outside Karen's room, his face tight with concern. "She had a nightmare, a severe one. She was screaming for nearly an hour before we could calm her down," Dr. Filler explained, lowering his voice. "But that's not all, Thomas. She remembered something else, something important." Thomas felt the weight of the words hang between them. "What did she say?" "She kept repeating a name, Michael Hargrove. I've checked, and Karen's never mentioned him before, but from the way she was saying it, it's clear he played a significant role in her captivity." Thomas furrowed his brow. The name didn't mean anything to him, but the urgency in Dr. Filler's tone suggested that it should. "I don't know who he is, but it's clear that Karen believes he was one of the people controlling what happened to her. I think it might be worth telling Detective Lynch about this immediately," Dr. Filler added. Without missing a beat, Thomas called Lynch and relayed the new information. The detective was quiet for a moment, then sighed deeply. "Michael Hargrove," Lynch muttered. "I know that name." Lynch's revelation was as unexpected as it was ominous. Michael Hargrove wasn't just anyone, he was a high-profile businessman with deep ties to government contract security firms, and, more disturbingly, several companies suspected of laundering money for criminal enterprises. Though no formal charges had ever stuck, Hargrove was known to operate in the gray areas of legality, using his influence to keep law enforcement and investigations at arm's length. "He's untouchable," Lynch explained over the phone. "The man has connections in every corner of the country. If Karen's saying his name, it means this goes even higher than we thought. Hargrove's been rumored to have ties to organized crime for years, but no one's ever been able to prove it." Thomas felt his world tilt again. This wasn't just about a cartel or even Abigail's betrayal anymore. The man pulling the strings was someone far beyond anything they had anticipated, a businessman with immense power, the kind of person who could bend the system to his will. Lynch quickly assembled a task force to delve deeper into Hargrove's operations. He needed to be careful. Hargrove's lawyers would be watching closely, and any misstep could lead to a backlash that might cost them the entire investigation. Meanwhile, back in the hospital, Karen's recovery took a sudden turn. With the memories of Hargrove resurfacing, she began speaking more freely, her mind slowly unlocking the events she had buried deep within her trauma. But it came at a cost. Each memory took a toll on her, pulling her back into the psychological horror of her captivity. Karen revealed that Hargrove had been a shadowy figure throughout her ordeal. She had only seen him a few times, but he was always accompanied by men who referred to him with respect and fear. He wasn't just buying women from the cartel, he was orchestrating it, creating a pipeline that fed the most powerful men in his circle. Abigail had been his lieutenant, but Hargrove was the one behind the curtain, pulling all the strings. Abigail said they were all watching, Karen whispered to Thomas one day, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "They wanted to break us, make us obedient." Thomas's blood ran cold. Hargrove wasn't just involved, he was the mastermind. The idea that this man, so far above the law, had been responsible for destroying Karen's life sent waves of rage and helplessness coursing through Thomas. But as Lynch's team closed in, the walls began to close around them too. Hargrove had eyes everywhere. The deeper they probed, the more apparent it became that someone within law enforcement or the justice system was feeding him information. Every time they got close to a breakthrough, their leads would dry up, and witnesses would disappear. Lynch knew time was running out. If they didn't act fast, Hargrove would slip through their fingers, just like Abigail had managed to for years. But Lynch had one last plan, one that involved getting to the one person Hargrove might not expect to turn on him, Abigail. In a desperate gamble, Lynch arranged a deal with Abigail's lawyer. If she could give them concrete evidence linking Hargrove to the trafficking ring, they would reduce her sentence. Abigail, ever the survivor, hesitated only briefly before agreeing. She knew the world she was playing in, and the only way to stay alive now was to take down the man who had once protected her. But as Abigail began to talk, the real danger became clear. Hargrove wasn't just a powerful man, he was ruthless, and anyone who stood in his way had a habit of disappearing. "Be careful," Detective Abigail warned, a faint smirk playing on her lips. "If you're coming for Hargrove, you better make sure you finish the job, because if you don't, he'll come for you." Detective Lynch didn't need Abigail's warning to know the danger he was stepping into. Michael Hargrove was more than a criminal mastermind, he was an untouchable figure, shielded by his wealth and influence. But now, with Abigail's cooperation, Lynch finally had the key to bring him down if only he could stay one step ahead of Hargrove's far-reaching grasp. Abigail's information led Lynch to a private estate on the outskirts of Chicago, a sprawling mansion with layers of security that suggested someone powerful was hiding within. It was here that Hargrove conducted his darkest business dealings. Abigail described the estate as more than just a home, it was a fortress, equipped with state-of-the-art surveillance, armed guards, and escape routes designed for quick disappearances. The women trafficked through Hargrove's network had been brought here before being shipped off overseas, where they would vanish into a nightmarish underworld of slavery and exploitation. But this time, Hargrove had miscalculated. Abigail knew enough to give Lynch an opening, a vulnerability in the security, a time when Hargrove would be vulnerable. It was a high-stakes gamble, and Lynch knew it. But if he didn't take the shot, Hargrove would slip through their fingers, vanishing once again behind his wall of lawyers, informants, and dirty politicians. Lynch's team, along with a specialized FBI unit, prepared for a covert raid on the estate. The operation had to be precise and quiet. If Hargrove got word of the plan, he would be gone before they even got close. Thomas, though desperate to be involved, was sidelined by Lynch. This wasn't just about bringing justice for Karen anymore. It was about dismantling an entire network of human trafficking, one with tendrils stretching far beyond Hargrove's personal wealth. The night of the raid, the air was thick with tension. Lynch sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, his team dressed in tactical gear and ready to move. The estate loomed ahead, hidden behind high walls and thick hedges. It looked like a palace, a symbol of Hargrove's untouchable status. "Remember," Lynch said quietly over the comms, "we're going in fast and quiet. No one gets out. If Hargrove escapes, we lose everything." The team moved swiftly through the shadows, disabling the outer security systems just as Abigail had instructed. Lynch's heart pounded as they crept toward the mansion. They breached the estate silently, sweeping through the lower floors without incident. But as they moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, they found what they had feared, a hidden sublevel. Lynch descended into the basement, his pulse racing as they found room after room filled with horrific evidence of Hargrove's crimes, trafficking manifests, videos of auctions, encrypted files detailing the sale of women. The basement was a dungeon, a place where Hargrove's depravity had been carefully documented. But the real prize was Hargrove himself. As Lynch reached the final corridor, he knew he was close. The intel had said this was the safest part of the mansion, the core of Hargrove's operations. And then, at the end of the hall, behind a reinforced door, they found him. Michael Hargrove was sitting in a leather armchair, perfectly calm. He didn't flinch when Lynch's team burst into the room. He didn't shout or scramble for an escape. Instead, he merely glanced up from the glass of whiskey in his hand, his face betraying nothing but mild amusement. "Well," Hargrove said, his voice smooth, unbothered, "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Lynch leveled his weapon at him, heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and anger. "You're under arrest, Hargrove." Hargrove chuckled softly, setting down his drink. "Do you really think this is going to stick, Detective? You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Lynch wasn't intimidated. He had heard men like Hargrove talk before, their arrogance masking the fear underneath. "You're not walking out of here this time," Lynch replied coldly. As the FBI cuffed Hargrove, he remained eerily calm, even as they led him out of the mansion. Lynch couldn't shake the feeling that the man was hiding something, a trump card waiting to be played. The arrest of Michael Hargrove sent shockwaves through the media and the criminal underworld. For the first time, someone with Hargrove's power and influence had been publicly taken down. The evidence recovered from the mansion was damning: detailed records of transactions, names of buyers, lists of victims. It was enough to send Hargrove away for life. But the fight wasn't over. Lynch knew Hargrove's legal team would throw everything they had at the case, and with his connections, there was a real possibility that some of the evidence could be suppressed or disappeared before trial. For Thomas, Hargrove's arrest brought a mixture of relief and frustration. While the man who had orchestrated Karen's suffering was finally behind bars, there was still so much left unresolved. Karen's recovery had been slow, and while she was talking more, she remained deeply scarred by the trauma she had endured. Hargrove's capture didn't erase the years of pain, the nightmares that still haunted her. Weeks after the arrest, Lynch called Thomas to meet him at the precinct. There was something in the detective's voice and edge, a concern that made Thomas uneasy. When Thomas arrived, Lynch was sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of papers. He looked up, his expression serious. "Hargrove's lawyers have been working overtime," Lynch said. "They're already trying to undermine the evidence we found at the mansion. They're going to drag this out as long as they can, and there's a real chance that some of the charges won't stick." Thomas felt a wave of frustration. So what does that mean? He could walk. Lynch leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Not likely, but it means the case could stretch on for years. Even if we nail him on some charges, he could use his connections to get reduced sentences, appeal after appeal. It's a long road ahead." Thomas stared at the floor, his fists clenching. "So, after everything he did, he still might get out of this?" Lynch shook his head. "We won't let that happen, Thomas. But you need to prepare yourself. Justice isn't always clean." As the weeks passed, the case against Hargrove moved slowly, entangled in legal maneuvering. Karen, meanwhile, continued her sessions with Dr. Filler, each day a battle to reclaim her life. But the scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal. One night, as Thomas sat beside Karen in their quiet home, she turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "I want to testify," she said. Thomas blinked, stunned. "Karen, you don't have to." "I do," she interrupted. "I need to. For the others, for the ones who didn't make it." Thomas's heart ached at her words. He knew how much it had taken for her to say that, to decide to confront her captor in court, but he also knew she was right. Hargrove had destroyed lives, and Karen's testimony could be the final nail in his coffin. As the trial loomed, Karen prepared herself, knowing that the road to justice would be long and painful. But this time she wouldn't be silenced. She would face Hargrove not as a victim, but as a survivor. And while the battle wasn't over, she was ready to fight. For herself, for Thomas, and for the countless women who had been lost to the shadows of Hargrove's empire. The war against Hargrove's network was far from over, but with Abigail in custody, Karen's courage to testify, and Lynch's determination, they had a fighting chance. Justice might be slow, but it was coming. Hargrove, for all his power, had underestimated the one thing he couldn't control: the will to survive. Karen's decision to testify against Michael Hargrove became the turning point in the case. The courtroom was tense the day she took the stand, facing the man who had orchestrated her nightmare. Hargrove sat there, cold and calculating, his eyes locked on Karen as she recounted the horrors she had endured. But Karen's voice didn't waver. She spoke for herself, for the women who couldn't, and for the justice that had been denied for too long. Her testimony, combined with the mountains of evidence Lynch's team had gathered, was enough to tip the scales. The jury deliberated for hours, but the verdict was inevitable. Hargrove was found guilty on all charges: human trafficking, conspiracy, and countless other crimes. His wealth and power couldn't protect him anymore. As the sentence was handed down, life without parole, Thomas felt a weight lift off his chest. It was far from a happy ending, but it was closure. Hargrove would never hurt anyone again. In the months that followed, Karen slowly began to rebuild her life. The scars, both visible and invisible, would never fully disappear, but with Thomas by her side, she found strength. Detective Lynch, too, found a sense of peace. The shadow of Hargrove's empire had finally crumbled, and while there were still battles to fight, they had won the most important one. For the first time in years, the nightmare was over. Justice, long delayed, had finally been served.